Have you heard of the UN? It stands for the United Nations. It is an organization that wants nations to work together. There are many countries in the world, almost 200. A lot of times, these countries don't agree with each other. They can get into a lot of arguments. That's where the UN comes in. It tries to get countries to work things out and get along. Ciao historians, welcome. My name is Abiola Afolayan. I am an international lawyer and I work with the UN. Today, I'm going to tell you a story about its history. It is a history that isn't often told. This is the story of Mary McLeod Bethune and Eleanor Roosevelt, two women who made UN history.
Hi, young historians. Welcome to another great episode of Anytime Now. I'm Brooke, the co-founder of Honest History, and this week we're going to explore a friendship that changed history. The two women in the story came from very different backgrounds and had greatly different childhood experiences. And yet, they shared a common mission, and together they formed a bond that would make their differences meaningless. Their friendship allowed them to overcome adversity and accomplish things that nobody would have thought possible during that time. As you listen to the story, think of ways you can work together with a friend to achieve a common goal, whether it's a school-related project or a project just for fun that you want to complete. How can you work as a team to accomplish this mission? Also, consider how you might be different from your friends and how they might be different from you. Think of how those unique differences can make you both stronger by working together and using those differences in a positive way. Oftentimes, it can be easy to dismiss others because they look different or have a different way of doing things. But those unique characteristics can create the best friendships as you both learn from each other. So, let's get back to the story and learn something from these two great friends.
Our story begins over 75 years ago. In June of 1945, Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune was in her home in Florida. She sat down at her desk to write a letter. She wanted to write down everything that had happened at a conference she went to. 2 months ago, she had traveled all the way to San Francisco, California for the conference. The conference had been all over the news.
Mrs. Bethune is off to the San Francisco conference as a special consultant. She received the appointment from the State Department.
Dr. Mary Bethune was famous across America. Wherever she went, people asked for her autograph. People knew her as an educator, civil rights activist, and most famously, advisor to the President of the United States. As a Black woman, she was dedicated to helping her fellow Black Americans. Mary had advised U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. She got to know the president because she was friends with his wife, the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. Like Mary, Eleanor advocated for women's rights and education. Mary and Eleanor came from very different worlds, though. Eleanor had grown up in New York City.
I'm walking here.
And came from a very wealthy family. Her uncle, Theodore Roosevelt, had been the 26th president of the United States. Both of Eleanor's parents had died by the time she was 10. After that, Eleanor went to live with her grandmother. There, she had a private tutor to teach her. When she was a bit older, she went to finishing school, which is a fancy school in England. Mary had grown up in South Carolina. Her parents, Sam and Patsy McLeod, had both been enslaved before Mary was born. Also, Mary came from a big family. She had 16 brothers and sisters. By the time Mary was born, slavery was illegal, and her parents were able to get paid for their work. Still, they struggled to save money, and Mary often picked cotton to help her family. When she was 10 years old, Mary got the chance to go to a local school. She became the first person in her family to learn how to read. It wasn't long before Mary realized how important education was. She wanted Black girls to have the same opportunity to learn. Even though Mary and Eleanor had such different childhoods, they became fast friends. The two were both passionate about women's rights and education. Eleanor joined many women's groups and worked as a teacher. As the First Lady, Eleanor became the president's eyes, ears, and legs. She would travel across the country and tell the president what she saw and heard. Eleanor was the first First Lady to have press conferences. Women were not normally allowed to go to the president's press conferences, so Eleanor decided only female reporters could come to her press conferences and ask her questions. In Florida, Mary Bethune started a small school for African American girls. Years later, the school joined with the boys' school and became the first college for Black Americans in Florida. Today, this college is called Bethune-Cookman University. Later, Mary became the 18th president of the National Association of Colored Women, NACW. She even started her own organization called the National Council of Negro Women. Both Mary and Eleanor had done a lot of work to help women in America, but Mary had an important role to play. She told Eleanor about the struggles of Black Americans. Eleanor often asked for Mary's advice. She thought her husband, President Roosevelt, should do the same. Mary began advising President Roosevelt on many issues. Also, later, she became the first African American woman to head a federal agency. This was the highest position a Black woman had ever had in U.S. government. In 1945, the U.S. State Department picked her to go to the conference in San Francisco, the event that had been all over the news. What was this conference? From April to June, leaders from around the world got together in San Francisco. They wanted to discuss something important: world peace. That year, the world had just come out of a Second World War. People had lived through not one, but two terrible wars. There was a question in everyone's mind: how do we stop wars from happening? This was the question Mary and many others were trying to answer at the conference. They wanted to write a document that would help countries work together. They called this document the Charter of the United Nations. The conference had been inside the beautiful San Francisco Opera House.
Figaro.
Sitting in her home in Florida, Mary remembered how everything looked inside the building.
On the stage, there were 4 pillars.
She wrote,
They were all decorated with olive green garlands.
these 4 pillars represented the 4 freedoms: freedom of speech,
77 years ago.
freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. These freedoms came from a speech President Roosevelt gave a few years earlier.
The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understanding which will secure to every nation a healthy, peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. The fourth is freedom from fear.
Between each pillar, there were flags of all the different countries at the conference. 50 different flags had been on stage. Over 3,000 people from 50 different countries had gathered in San Francisco to discuss world peace. Mary loved meeting and talking to all the different people at the conference.
It was a colorful, international, interracial assembly.
She wrote, many of the people at the conference had been consultants. They were experts about certain things and went to the conference to give advice. They advised on things like labor, agriculture, and education. Mary was one of these consultants. Mary was only one of the 3 African American consultants at the conference. As a consultant, it was Mary's job to advise the American delegates. These delegates will help write that very important document, the Charter of the United Nations. Mary had a few ideas that she wanted to be included in the Charter. She believed that these ideas would help people around the world. She was passionate about education and human rights. Unfortunately, many of her ideas were not included, but Mary was hopeful. As she sat in her home in Florida, she thought back to the conference.
Not all that many of us hoped for was accomplished in San Francisco.
Mary wrote.
But no one can deny that the conference was certainly a definite start in the right direction.
Mary was impressed by the charter. It created an organization that would promote peace and better living standards for all. Today, this organization is known as the United Nations, or the UN.
The charter is a historic document.
She wrote.
It is written in 5 languages.
Mary encouraged everyone to read it. Mary was the only Black woman who was an official representative when the UN was formed. She believed in the mission of the UN. After she got back from the conference, Mary wrote,
"We all need to know one another so much better than we do, for it is only through knowing people that we come to understand them."
Mary believed that if people work together, we could realize that we aren't so different from one another. Mary's friend Eleanor felt the same way. The United Nations was something that her husband, President Roosevelt, wanted to create. Unfortunately, the president was never able to see how it all turned out. He died a couple of weeks before the conference. After her husband died, Eleanor thought her work with the UN was over. The new president, Harry Truman, did not think so. Later that year, he sent her a letter.
My dear Mrs. Roosevelt,
He wrote,
I am pleased to inform you that I have appointed you one of the representatives of the United States for the United Nations.
He was inviting her to the very first meeting of the UN as an American delegate. At first, Eleanor wasn't sure if she wanted to go.
How could I be a delegate to help organize the United Nations when I have no background or experience in international meetings?
She asked President Truman. She had done plenty of work in the US, but not as much with other countries. She was worried that she wouldn't know how to do the job. President Truman was sure that she could. As Eleanor thought about it, she started to agree with him. In January 1946, Eleanor sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to London for the first meeting of the United Nations. She would be the first woman to represent the US at the UN. Since that first meeting in 1946, the UN has tried to get nations to work together. Today, almost all countries in the world are part of the UN. Together, these countries try to make sure that everyone has what they need to live a good life: food, shelter, a clean environment, medicine, dignity, and safety. The meetings are usually held in New York City.
I just said I'm walking here.
The UN has other offices too in Switzerland, Kenya, and Austria. Countries have gotten together to discuss war, healthcare, climate, even outer space. The UN has made 560 treaties. These treaties are agreements between many different nations. While some of their treaties may seem complicated, there is one that connects you with all the other children around the world: the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, also known as CRC. In 1989, the leaders of the world got together to make a promise to protect children around the world. Today, the CRC is an agreement between over 196 different nations. Right now, the US has signed the treaty, but it has not ratified it. Ratify means to officially agree to it. The US would need 2/3 of the Senate to vote yes. The CRC has been translated to Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, and Spanish. Its goal is to make sure children can learn, play, and grow during their childhood. It is a long document. There's a preamble, which is an introduction. Then there are 54 different parts called articles. The articles list different rights of children around the world, like the right to name and nationality, the right to education and healthcare, the right to freedom of thought and speech. These rights are the rights of all children. It does not matter which country they're from. Mary McLeod Bethune and Eleanor Roosevelt were not alive when the CRC was created. Even though they did not live to see it, Mary and Eleanor probably would have been happy to know that the UN is trying to help children around the world. Mary Bethune had spent her life doing good and courageous work for the young people. The story of Mary McLeod Bethune and Eleanor Roosevelt is just one part of UN history. My dear historians, I hope you would want to know more. Remember, don't be afraid to do some of your own research. There's so much more you can learn. Ciao.
Hi, Brooke here. Wasn't that an incredible story? I love how these two brave women fought together for children's rights around the world. It's possible that without their friendship, children in many countries wouldn't have the same rights they have today. There's still a long way to go, though. And there's room for more brave friends who want to pick up where Mary and Eleanor left off. So next time you have a disagreement with a friend, think about how overcoming differences and working together can have a huge impact on history. That's it for now. We're busy working on more exciting episodes about incredible stories from history. If you can't wait to go on more adventures through the past, check out Honest History's books and magazines. We have adventure for everyone. See you next time. This episode was hosted by Abiola Afolayan and written by Heidi Coburn. Production was led by Randall Lawrence. To learn more about this episode, including more about the host, visit us at honesthistorymag.com and follow along for updates on social media at Honest History.